An original podcast from podlatino.com.
Making a quick decision and feeling confident it was right is one of the most common experiences in everyday life. Someone shows up late to a meeting and within seconds you've already formed an opinion about them. You walk into a restaurant, see it's empty, and something in you hesitates. You hear the first few seconds of a song and you already know whether you're going to like it. The mind works at an impressive speed, and what's most interesting isn't the speed itself, it's the confidence that comes with it. We rarely stop to ask ourselves how we reach that conclusion. We just reach it and it feels right, it feels solid, it feels true. But what happens when that feeling of having understood something doesn't come from actually analyzing it, but from following a familiar path? That question is the starting point for something psychology has been studying for decades: cognitive biases. Not as mistakes made by unintelligent people, not as moral failures or signs of carelessness, but as a structural feature of human thinking. A feature that makes sense, that serves a real purpose, but that also carries a cost we often don't see. The human mind processes an enormous amount of information every single moment. Visual input, sounds, conversations, decisions, memories, expectations, environmental pressures. If it had to evaluate every single one of those elements with the same level of attention and depth, it would shut down. It couldn't function at the pace real life demands. So it developed something highly efficient: shortcuts. Mental routes that allow it to reach a conclusion quickly without having to rebuild the analysis from scratch every time. Those shortcuts are cognitive biases, and far from being system errors, they're a central part of how thinking organizes itself to get through a world that doesn't wait. The problem isn't that they exist, it's that most of the time we don't know when we're using them. And when a shortcut leads to a wrong interpretation, the mind doesn't necessarily catch it. In fact, it tends to feel the same sense of certainty it would feel if it had reached a correct conclusion. That's what makes biases so hard to spot from the inside. They don't hurt, they don't announce themselves. There's no internal alarm that goes off and says you thought through that too fast. They just feel like normal thinking, because as far as the mind is concerned, that's exactly what they are. Think about something concrete. A person meets someone in an uncomfortable situation. Maybe that person was nervous, distracted, having a bad day, working through something difficult that had nothing to do with that moment. But whoever observed them formed an impression, and that impression tends to stick. First perceptions carry disproportionate weight. Information that comes in later, if it contradicts that initial image, often gets dismissed or reframed to fit what was already formed. Not out of bad intentions, not because the person is being unfair, but because the mind seeks consistency. It would rather hold on to a stable image than constantly revise it. Revising costs energy, holding on doesn't. That drive for consistency also shows up when we look for information about things we already care about. There's a natural pull toward paying more attention to what confirms what we already think and giving less weight to what challenges it. It's not a matter of deliberately ignoring data. It's that attention isn't neutral. It's filtered by what we already believe, by what we already expect to find. Someone who has a theory about how a certain dynamic works at their job will more easily notice the examples that support it. The ones that don't will fade into the background, get written off as exceptions, outliers, noise. And by the end of the day, that person will feel like the evidence proved them right, when in reality they chose, without realizing it, which evidence to see and which to let go. The same thing happens with memory, which we tend to idealize as if it were a recording. Memory doesn't store what happened accurately. It's an active reconstruction, shaped by what we know today, by how we feel right now, by what came after the moment we're trying to recall. It's common to remember having known something in advance when we actually had no idea. or to remember an argument in a way that favors our side, with no conscious manipulation involved. Memory adjusts, and it does so quietly, so imperceptibly, that it becomes almost impossible to tell apart from what actually happened. We remember versions, and we treat them as facts. Emotions play a significant role in all of this too. When something frightens us, the risk feels larger than it probably is. When we're excited about something, the obstacles seem smaller, more manageable, less threatening. Emotional state acts like a lens that magnifies or minimizes certain aspects of reality, and the mind treats those adjustments as real data, not as distortions. Someone going through a period of uncertainty will interpret ambiguous signals more negatively than someone in a stable moment. Same signal, same apparent situation, completely different interpretation. Biases don't operate in a vacuum. They're activated by everything around them: fatigue, mood, the pressure of the moment, personal history. Past experience also carries enormous weight in how these shortcuts form. What we've already lived through shapes what we expect to live through next, and what we expect shapes what we perceive. If someone has had bad experiences with certain types of situations or people, they'll read ambiguous signals with more suspicion, even when there's no concrete reason for it in that specific moment. The brain learns patterns and applies them. That's a useful function because it means not having to start from scratch in every new situation, being able to anticipate, protect yourself, move faster through familiar terrain. But it can also lead to seeing patterns that aren't there, or to closing the book on a person or a situation long before there's enough information to do so. There's something else worth naming here because it tends to go unnoticed. There's a widely shared tendency to spot biases in other people more easily than in ourselves. When someone else jumps to a conclusion, when someone else seems to only be seeing what they want to see, when someone else defends a position with more emotion than reasoning, we notice. We register it internally, sometimes out loud. But when we're the ones doing exactly the same thing, we experience it as clear thinking, as direct perception, as plain common sense. That asymmetry isn't hypocrisy. It's simply that your own process is never visible from the outside. You don't observe your shortcuts, you live inside them. What makes it even more complicated is that knowing biases exist doesn't make them go away. That's worth saying clearly because it's easy to assume that enough information or enough self-awareness solves the problem. It doesn't work that way. There's no finish line where the mind stops simplifying, stops seeking consistency, stops choosing speed over exhaustive analysis. That's not a realistic goal, and probably not a desirable one either. The goal, if there is one, is more modest and at the same time far more useful, building the habit of pausing before feeling like you've fully understood something, especially when that feeling arrives too fast, too easily, too comfortably. When certainty costs nothing, it's worth asking how much real thinking actually went into it. Because thinking fast isn't a flaw, it's a capacity that allows us to function, adapt, and make decisions in real time without collapsing under the weight of every detail. But there's a real difference between thinking fast and seeing clearly, and that difference often isn't visible from the inside, which is exactly where we live. The mind isn't a mirror that reflects reality as it is. It's a tool that interprets it, organizes it, and simplifies it to make it manageable. It does that well most of the time, but it also distorts, edits, and fills in the gaps using what it already knows, what it already expects, what it needs things to be in order to keep everything in order. Recognizing that doesn't mean distrusting every thought you have or living in a permanent state of self-questioning. It means something simpler and more sustainable, holding the certainties that arrive without effort with a little more humility, not because they're necessarily wrong, but because the ease with which they showed up isn't enough to guarantee they're right. The mind works fast and it works on its own. And sometimes what it presents as a clear conclusion is nothing more than a familiar road travelled one more time.